everyone. Welcome to Monetize Innovation. I am John Holcomb, and innovation isn't just about the big idea on the whiteboard. It's about the hard decisions, the mixed signals, and the leaders who keep moving forward anyway. This show dives into the real stories behind breakthroughs in life sciences, healthcare, and tech, how ideas become results, how teams align under pressure, and how strategy turns into execution. If you're building something bold or looking for clarity to lead with confidence, you're in the right place. Press play and let's turn innovation into impact. Today's episode, we have a great guest, Andrea Adamo. He is the founder and CEO of Zaiput Flow Technologies, a pioneering company developing advanced flow chemistry solutions that accelerate chemical innovation and process scale-up. With deep expertise in intersection of chemical engineering, entrepreneurship, and technology commercialization, Andrea has transformed laboratory insight into industrial impact, helping organizations optimize complex chemical processes and bringing innovative products to market faster. Known for blending scientific rigor with business strategy, he brings a yet visionary perspective on technology, adoption, innovation pipelines, and value creation. Join us as we explore leadership, innovation, and chemistry, and turning breakthrough ideas into the real-world value. Well, thank you, Andrea, for joining us today. Really just so pleased to have you on this episode.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure. Thank you for the very nice and kind introduction.
No, it's very true. And so for some of our listeners, I've had the good fortune of working with Andrea now for many years. And Andrea is truly a pioneer and a thought leader in the field. And so when we talk about monetizing innovation, he is definitely an expert. So, Andrea, with some of that too, I would love to hear some of your thoughts of how, you really started Zaiput in the beginning, especially with some of the flow chemistry capabilities.
So Zaiput started really from a longing. It was a longing of exploring the journey that goes from conceiving an idea to giving things into the hands of people. I think that relates to a personal opinion I have of innovation, that in order to be as such, it needs to actually benefit people. Otherwise, it's a nice discovery, it's a nice technology, it's a nice idea, a nice article, but I think innovation needs to come to fruition. And I wanted to explore all that journey myself.
And you really have, right? When you think about some of the work that you started even back at MIT and how you actually converted that concept right into a company to do just that.
I think that the journey did allow me to see most of it. And actually what happened along the way is that by getting excited, then we started thinking, okay, what other technologies can we commercialize or bring to market? I think in this journey, one of the elements is that the learning has been instrumental to shape new decisions and new approaches. The learning as an individual, also as a company, and also the learning about a specific market segment, because although different markets have similarities, they also have differences.
No, definitely. And, one of the things I think about just some of the work that you've done is, you really have taken into account the needs of the user. And by really understanding those needs of the user, and understanding their ecosystem, you really tried to build solutions, right, that advance that macro trend of flow chemistry.
So the buyers, there's books written on classification of buyers and so on. But at the end of the day, you have to have some technical argument and some financial argument, because especially the economic buyer will look at, what's my advantage? Why do I have to do this investment? So it really boils down to what is the core value proposition, but the value proposition really seen from the customer. So there may be a value proposition that is good in general for a market segment, but that doesn't mean it's good for each and every single customer, because even there would be some variability. So I think that was also part of the journey, learning how to better articulate the value proposition by talking to people and learning from them what's important to them.
I think that's so critical, right? I mean, what you're really outlining is the basics of job theory, right? You're trying to understand what was that customer's job and then what solutions are relevant to them. And I think with some of that, right, you've built your first product line was some of the flow separators. Maybe you could talk through a little bit of that journey and what led you to that first product.
So the journey actually, it's a very nice question. This is a dive back in the past. So that was conceived in an academic environment. There was a project. It was actually a daring project sponsored by DARPA, which is a government agency related to the military. So DARPA wanted MIT to build a portable system for making pharmaceuticals. And so I ended up taking care of the engineering of a nice chunk of that equipment. And this is more than 15 years ago. So we actually didn't really have the tools that we needed for that type of job at that scale, that small scale, because it need to be something that you could transport. So in the context, I started developing my tools, and the phase separation technology stood out for novelty, compactness, and performance as well. And it was the feedback of people, actually, the colleagues, oh, I need another separator. Can I have it? Can I have it? And so through that, I started thinking that perhaps the demand that I had within the academic laboratories was representative of a need. And so I started looking better at the business proposition behind. What happened next was that I decided to pull the trigger because I really wanted to explore this journey from conception to commercialization. And the company actually started in my basement. The first device was a laboratory scale device, so I could take care of most of the things in my basement. My wife allowed me such undertaking. And I started traveling, going to conferences, talking about the device, meeting people. I probably should have done it earlier, this deep conversation with the customers to understand what their needs are and what is it that excites them about the potential solution that we have or we may have. And so that's how it all began. And then I realized that the proposition was serious enough. And then I went on renting lab space and hiring people to grow the activities.
One of the things I love about that, and I think to some degree you're a little bit modest because what you really did is you dove into the deep end, right? That was really just trying to dive in and understand what the customer and market need was, right? Based on the initial feedback.
Yes, I did. The mistake that I think I did there is that I started doing that once I already had a product, so to speak. I think you want to do it before. In my case, there was the academic experience. The product had been developed for an academic project. And so I already had an object, and the genesis, the history was started in a different way and different reason. If you want to start from scratch and think of a technology, I think you want to do the homework earlier.
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with the approach that you've done for sure, because I think what you had, right, was a hypothesis, and then you went and tested it.
Yes.
Which is fantastic, right? Because it's I think some innovators don't go back and check with the customer. Is it really what they care about, right?
In this checking process, though, we did make sales. So those were instrumentals to, that was really our first fundraising. It was sales with limiting the costs. We were very careful on the cost structure and, pile up some money to go to the next stage of the company.
I think that's actually such an important lesson for early innovators to understand exactly what you did, because you actually had folks, right, that with their feet. They put money into buying some of the early samples, the early prototypes, right? And that actually
is the biggest form of flattery, I think, for an engineer, when somebody wants to pay for something you've designed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fantastic, right? Because that is actually some of the most important validation that you can receive in the marketplace. And it's so fascinating too, because then you took there and you started with that early lab scale work, right? But then you started to look at how the device and your product line could potentially scale across not just the lab scale, but really into industry, which is, I know, it's sort of your ultimate goal too with any of these products. But could you share a little bit of that journey as well?
Yes, I think this is a very nice question. Thank you, John. So in the space where we operate, which is essentially tools for chemical processing, mostly in the pharmaceutical segment, typically users want to have a device that starts at the laboratory scale where they developed the molecule, the process. In the pharma case, that's when they start the early testing and then the clinical trials. And then they need a bigger version to make more material. Typically, they call it a pilot plant. And that is what takes them through the clinical trials. Once the product is approved, so the drug is released, then you need to have production because you gotta sell the product. And so there is a benefit for the customer to have technologies that scale in the sense that the results that are produced at the laboratory scale match the pilot, match the plant, and so you don't need to retweak. And so there's value there. And the way it plays out is essentially if we as an engineering company take care of those engineering aspects, that's value for the customer because they don't have to take care of that or worry about that. So that's the scalability. Indeed, when you go to larger scale, the market is larger, it's bigger equipment that people would acquire for making money. And so they're willing to spend a little bit more on something that generates a return because they can calculate an ROI in that context. In the laboratory scale, what's the ROI, right? It's hard for them to calculate. It's hard for us to represent, in all honesty, because putting hard numbers is difficult in those contexts.
Did you find early on that there were key metrics that were really important? So when you couldn't convert it to ROI, but like in the early days, what were some of the key metrics that you used to say, hey, I think we've got the right product to move forward with, even at lab scale?
So I think the smaller you go, the closer you are to the lab, the more it's technical performance. Because at the early stage, the cost of the equipment is low or relatively low. So the economic buyer doesn't kick in as much as later on. So I think it's a little bit more driven by the technical value proposition, especially for the early adopters. They do want to see a path of success for them. Because if it is something that becomes a roadblock, it's a non-starter. So the questions about scalability, about industrial applications, we started getting them very early on as well. And I am sure that actually when we started, our answers were not very strong because we had just started. And I'm sure we lost business on that as well. I think that the buyers will do a risk-based analysis. It's not only what's the return of investment, but also what are the risks in embarking into a certain journey. And so if the technology is too finicky, then there is risk. If the technology is not scalable, there is risk. They will articulate that certainly internally. Sometimes they share some thoughts, but they go through the thinking process.
Yeah, I love what you share there too, because it's very consistent with sort of the whole notion of a minimally viable product, right? And that your first iteration, especially with a lot of the lab communities, it's got to meet the technical performance first. And then once you get past that hurdle, you revise your sort of MVP parameters, right? To look at scale and look at some of these other key value propositions that you have to do it almost in a stage-based process, right? You can't just jump to scale. You have to prove that it works first. Yeah.
You do, and then you have to prove that it scales. You gotta do both. But yeah, so regarding the minimum viable product, you definitely need one because you need to get to something that creates the basis for additional risk taking from the company side. The only thing I would add there is that it's important to find the right partners for the evaluation of that minimum viable product. Customer, if you find a customer that is in a hurry all the time, your minimum your simpler product, it isn't a product, it's a prototype or an advanced prototype. So it needs to be understood that you want to provide a way to test out the idea, but without being the product itself So expectations have to be set, to be met in a proper way. So I think that is something that is part of the development of the minimum viable product, identifying the correct people, the correct parties that also are able to see beyond the shortcomings that this product will have and help you describe the value that they see in the innovation you're bringing forth.
I think what you just shared there is so important, right? Because it's one, the vision of where the product can go, but it's also being very explicit of where the prototype, the advanced prototype of what you're sharing today, of where it's at, right? And here is the key metric that we're going to work with you, customer A, to prove out the value.
So yeah, and we have a lot of stories there. Certain cases were more successful, certain other less successful, but it wasn't that people didn't want to collaborate, it was just a mindset thing. So, if somebody says that is not happy, you also have to understand where they're coming from. And I think the best thing is always to talk because you see where people are coming from, if there is an opportunity, of course.
I completely agree with you. And I mean, that's one of the things I think so important about like job theory, right? Is where you're trying to understand what the customer's needs are. And sometimes we assume that the customers are all, their needs are all the same, right? In reality, it's like, no, one customer has more pain points over here. Here's where the other customer is.
Very much so. Let's say, to phrase in a different way, you want to find the customers that allow you to get to the next stage, but you should be careful in not creating a bias into that customer selection, because then you have a bias in your understanding of the market.
And it's so important, right? Because that is why you want to be customer centric. It's so easy, right? That if you put blinders on, you can actually start going down the opposite path of what's really going to be economically viable.
Yes, very much so.
I know. I love that sharing because that is so important. And when you look at some of that too, I think it's fascinating. Like you said, some of this journey had started about 15 years ago, but then you also look at some of the work that you went from then lab scale to pilot and to production. What were some of the key learnings as you kind of progressed from some of those stages?
So there were a lot of learnings. Some of them started from the technical domain because you change environment and regulations change. Personnel skills change. In the lab, usually our customer is a chemist that has a PhD. When you get to the plant, is a plant operator that may not have a degree or a university degree. So the way the technologies have to be conceived, or even the device design, have to be amenable to different users by different type of user profiles. Compliance changes, and so you have to familiarize with what's adequate for the environment. The business on the business side, the decision making is also a little bit different. I mean, I was hinting at it a little bit earlier because there needs to be a clear ROI, a benefit. And this benefit gets also evaluated against overall risks. If something is too cumbersome to assemble or to clean, even though the technology may be interesting, it doesn't excite the buyer because he sees the door for a risk, for a problem. The equipment downtime, for instance, or errors made in the assembly of the device every time that needs to be cleaned. And all these aspects were not to us when we started. So that was part of the journey as well. The other thing is that different customer segments, even though from the same industry, may have different motivations. So contract manufacturing for drugs that are covered by a patent is very different than making generics because the financials of those productions are different. There's a lot more money available in a drug that is patented. There's more margin for the pharmaceutical company, but for the entire providers there than what it can be in a generics company. And so even though they're both manufacturers of pharmaceutical products, they will look at things in a fundamentally different way. And that was also some of the differences that we started to appreciate along the way, as we increased the number of conversations and we collected broader feedback.
And I think that's such a great point because you kind of found out two things, right? That even though it was one big segment, that there were smaller segments, and then you also found that there might be multiple value propositions depending on who you're talking to.
Yes, very much so. Very segmented, the market with potentially different drivers or roadblockers, actually, because if you don't have a driver, if the driver is weak, then it's actually a roadblocker.
Absolutely, because well, especially if you're bringing some of the new technology, right, that you and Zaiput have brought to the market. One of those things that you run into is there is that inherent switching cost, right? Because this is how they've always done it, and now you're trying to have them think in a different fashion, and unless that value overcomes the pain, right?
Pretty much so, yes.
Yeah. So when you went through some of those different lessons, especially when you look at the scaling side of things, I'm sure new problems popped up, right? It wasn't just the original core separation problem, but it was sort of these maybe secondary aspects that you had to worry about, right? In terms of the production or some of the different quality expectations, maybe, of the device. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yes, so the way we navigated a lot of these things was sometimes you find out in a smart way by reading, educating yourself. Sometimes you find in the hard way. You have a meeting with a customer and asks you a question that you aren't prepared to answer. Sometimes there's more surprise, sometimes there's less surprise, and then you go back and do your homework and study, try to fix it. Some of the things we've dealt with consultants. I think in the phase separation technology, eventually we didn't really have major game stoppers, I would say. I think what we learned again was this reinforcement of different drivers and different needs. I think what we learned was that the displacement of the incumbent sometimes may be more difficult to do than what we had anticipated. And so, staying with the separation technology, the technology has a number of advantages, but when we win the customer right away is when there is a separation challenge. If the separation challenge isn't strong enough, especially at large scale, then the driver for change is not strong enough as perceived from the customer. And so even though we have articulated financial benefits, ROIs, and so on, in a way that even the customers agree that is well done, they would agree with the numbers, we still see resistance because they have the fear of changing the operation on the floor plan. And how does that entail? And the time might suck, and the potential challenges they would have with the regulatory bodies and so on, the paperwork that might bring in. So, in all honesty, this we had not fully anticipated until we had the product ready there, and you see that just less people than what you hoped are. However, every cup can be, if it is half full, it can be half empty. So I tend to be the things in the half full type of approach. And that learning actually was very instrumental for the approach that we've taken to the product lines that we actually just released last year. What's fundamentally different is that the journey started already with experience and was conducted in a different way. So certain types of conversation, insight, whether it be technical on the scalability or key drivers for adoption by the customer, we looked at them on day one, if not day zero. And I guess there was some satisfaction in that journey, which is still ongoing because the release has been recent, that, experience does play a role. So, I believe that fail fast, iterate fast is a very good way of moving forward. Perhaps not in any case or in every case, but in general, there's so much that you learn by doing something because there's a lot of questions that you can't even anticipate. There's only so many things I can come up with. But believe me, there's a lot more that I cannot think of that people will bring forth. And so that type of discussion, interaction, and questioning, I think it's critical to improving, creating a virtuous cycle of improvement of your thinking process.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think being that continuous student of the business right? Because once you really go deep and you continue to learn deeper, you start understanding that, yeah, there's so many, it's such a layered decision making process, right? And that really does come with experience and that desire to learn. And I really like what you said. Yeah, fail fast and learn fast. I think you just brought up such great insight there that it's really important that folks realize, especially in the innovation space, right, that you're driving and now trying to drive to a multi-product, family, especially for the organization, is such a great milestone. And it's also kind of one of these inflection points, right? As you look at the organization and the work to move forward, what are some of the challenges that you found as now that you are building multiple product lines basically for the company?
So there's a variety of things. So I should start actually with the synergies, perhaps. So the reason to go into different product lines was dictated or was motivated essentially by the desire to grow the company. And one way is to sell more, but if you're bound to certain time scales, pharma is a slow moving field in general. And so is capital equipment. Then another way to grow fast is actually to have more things to sell. However, the crowd, our customer base stays the same. So, it could be seen as a distraction. I actually see it as a synergy because, an important part of the commercial journey is building credibility. Customers, you want to develop a relationship with your customers, and the customers have to trust you. Trust is something that is very difficult to win. It takes forever. It's very easy to lose. It takes an instant, but it's an essential part of the journey because in that trust, there is conversation and there is people eventually, they want to buy from big brands because those are recognized and recognizable. So there is the idea behind is an idea of trust, no name brand. Can I trust it? It's really what people ask in their mind. And so, the things you make, you gotta sell them. A company can be boiled down to the people who make the thing and the people that sell it, to its simplest description. And so for us, having the same crowd, the same customer base, we can have the same salespeople that now can have more products to sell. So there's an important synergy and strategy, in my opinion, in there. The core problems are always the same, meaning, do you have what's the value proposition and how does that relate to the customer? Is a scalable technology? How does that look like managing the risk as perceived from the customer? So what we have seen in there is that in terms of general, let's say, product positioning, I think we've done a much better job this time leveraging all the experience from the separation technology. The technologies that we've brought forth, one is for a specific class of reactions, it's called hydrogenation. It needs a precious metal-based catalyst, so it's expensive to run and it's dangerous because of the hydrogen. And the other technology is crystallization, which crystallization is used to purify drugs. 90% of drugs in the marketplace are purified through a crystallization process. So what we find there is that both these two things are not new. There's no new invention per se in the fundamentals of the disciplines. It's the pieces of hardware that we bring forth that offer control, cost savings, and so on. And so here the challenge is the displacement of the incumbent. The technologies are so new that the customers get excited, they want to have more information. So it boils down to risk management. How can we help them generate data, or how can we help ourselves de-risk the technology as seen from the customer? I think this is perhaps the bigger challenge that we are dealing with now.
What you highlight though to me is really powerful is you didn't go after just like any adjacency, right? You really looked at the macro trend of flow chemistry and you saw some of these different challenges that were necessary to bring the whole flow chemistry forward. I just share that because that may not be as inherently obvious to the audience, right? But I do think that that's a very powerful point that you make, right? It's by applying those learnings, you're really bringing those synergies together. And it's still slow.
Thank you for highlighting that. It is actually very true what you're saying. So one challenge, let's call it price that we have paid for that is that when you do a move onto a different, completely different product, even though it's synergistic with your offering, there's also big technical learning curve in there. Technical for what it pertains engineering of the device, but also how the customer sees what are the needs in specific hydrogenation crystallization. So that's indeed very true. I would add also based on the journey that has gone on. So perhaps I should share with the audience this thing, classical pharmaceutical manufacturing is done with a batch-based approach. The new trend that started 10, 15 years ago, perhaps a little bit more, is to try to look at continuous ways of making drugs. By continuous, it means that the molecules are really traveling through a journey, at different stations of the journey, they get some transformation. The easy way to understand it is by analogy with the assembly line invented by Ford to make cars. So what we have seen, I personally believe that continuous is the future. Probably it'll take another 20 years. I don't know if it's more or less, but the time horizon is a little long still. But the key learning is that at the end of the day, it's the value proposition that will drive choices. So for the hydrogenation, for instance, I think the value proposition is very strong. And that I think gives us a very strong market opportunity, whether people want to call it continuous, want to call it batch, if there's a lot of benefit, it doesn't matter if anything else was done in batch and I do this continuous. And the reason I'm sharing this is because sometimes, there is labeling of approaches or disciplines and so on. And there's good things in there. There's free marketing that happens, with the appropriate labels. Some of it could be more beneficial or less beneficial. But at the end of the day, I think the key aspect is being able to articulate a strong value proposition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that you've done I'd say a master class in terms of trying to actually really refine that value proposition right over the years and really work with customers to work through both the technical and the economic value propositions.
We are still working on it.
Well, I tell you what, Andre, this has absolutely been a fantastic conversation. Is there anything that you'd really like to make sure you highlight with the audience from some of your thoughts and approach forward?
Well, perhaps there's 2 or 3 thoughts, I guess, concluding with Zaiput. So I guess one thing that I would share with the company, about the company. So the company has been devoted to innovation in the chemical processing stage. We are a for-profit company, so we want to have a very healthy and robust business. But one thing that we have made sure at Zaiput is that human beings come first. So I think anything that human beings do is for human beings. It's not for money, it's for human beings. And money is something that human beings need to live. I think this is important because what I've observed is that when things get difficult and there are moments of challenge of different nature, it could be financial, it could be strategic, it could be commercial. The way to make choices is by, at least the way that we have been making choices, by having priorities set in the right order. And so at Zaiput, the priority is always human beings first, and then all the other things. And when there's a list of priorities of values, right, I think it's easier to make choices that then bring fruit. So I would encourage everybody to have a set of values for themselves, understand what the priorities are. The second thing I would share is that this is not about the company, it's actually about you, John. I think you are a tremendous leader with a lot of drive, a lot of insight, a lot of wisdom. I have had the privilege of knowing you for a number of years now. I forget when we met. I think it's, I don't know, it's more than 5 years. I forget. I should look at some records. But every time I've met you, I've learned something. So you've been a source of inspiration and learning. Your past large company experience, I think, is also has been, something that has brought a lot of different ways of seeing things. So for me, it's been a tremendous learning opportunity. So I hope we can continue in the future to have conversations, but also I would encourage the audience to stick to what John has to say because there's wisdom in there that is precious.
Thank you for your kind words, Andre. I truly appreciate that.
So,
Well, no, thank you so much. As always, just truly enjoy our conversations, and we'll make sure that we have all the contact information for you too in the write up for the podcast. And thank you for sharing your valuable insights. It's, I think, truly impressive. And I think as a group of innovators and entrepreneurs, it's so important to build this community to have these types of learning. So thank you.
John, thank you for the opportunity. This was a pleasure. Lovely chat as usual.
Thank you, my friend. We'll look forward to continuing these conversations here soon.
Very well. Goodbye.